It's definitely not a mainstream subject in history of architecture, but at least for me, it's really intriguing. So I hope that you will also find it interesting. Up till the 9th century, Slavs usually lived in dugouts or half-dugouts, which means huts with walls or at least larger part of walls under the ground. By the entrance there was a sloping passage or a ladder leading down to the hut. Dugouts and half-dugouts were usually square and small. Very small. Only one single space, about 6 to 7 square meters or about 70 square feet if you prefer. And the whole family lived there. Sounds cozy? Imagine lack of windows. No sunlight, no fresh air, especially during winter when the only door was surely closed. Still cozy? Add to that high humidity level due to groundwaters, especially after rain. Now you should have some notion about the quality of living there. An entrance was placed in the southern wall due to the best insulation. Doors were probably braided and covered with leather or fabric. By the opposite wall, in the northeast corner, there was a stove made of stone or clay. An alternative was a fireplace surrounded by stones placed near the middle. However, there were external fireplaces in front of dugouts as well, as most of the time was spent outside. Beddings were made of straw, leather and fabrics, placed on hard earthen floor. Walls were built with massive logs connected in a quite clever way. Gaps in the walls were sealed with moss and clay. A roof construction could be supported on poles placed in the middle of the southern and the northern wall, or on two forked poles placed by these walls and protruding above the roof covering. Let's take a closer look at this appealing construction. On these forked poles there was a massive beam. The next step was placing structural beams according to the roof's angle of inclination. The next layer was made of relatively slender beams or braid. Roof could be covered simply with earth and grass or with touch of straw or reed. This roof construction was first known in Slavic tribes already in ancient times, but in the 11th century it became very popular also in Scandinavia, and for some reason nowadays it's mostly related with that region. Let's get out above the ground and take a look at more sophisticated huts. Well, they were not really sophisticated, to be honest. Initially, there was only one room, however larger than in the case of dugouts. Before entering it, there was often sort of a vestibule. They were built directly on the ground, without foundations. There were a few types of construction. Block structure, like the one here. Post and plank structure, like this. We'll get back to this construction. And an interlacing technique, like this. In the latter case, walls were coated with clay. Even though these dwellings were above ground, they were still very isolated from the outside. There was only one tiny window, which was used rather as a ventilation than a source of daylight. At the beginning, windows were just opening in logs, but then they gained framing, with time richly decorated. Doors in Dark Ages were also really small to keep houses as compact as possible. Despite the popular view, the height of inhabitants was almost the same as people living today and had nothing to do with those little doors. Just like windows, they were usually facing south, eventually east. Ancient Slavs associated south with sun, warmth and life. As chimneys weren't known then, smoke from stoves or fireplaces went through openings in roofs. Nevertheless, lots of seeds stayed inside. There were no tables inside dwellings of ancient Slavs, but inside huts there was place for farm animals. Even though ancient Slavic huts can look somehow basic, they were built in a well thought out way, or maybe rather strongly based on superstitions, which would protect them from evil forces and attract good luck. So here are Slavic do's and don'ts. Building dwellings in places where before there were roads or people were buried? Absolutely unacceptable. Starting building a hut right after the new moon. The right timing. Planting a tree in the middle of a yard while constructing hut's foundations? Good idea. Placing wool or money under corners of bottom logs? Bodes for wealth and happiness. Sacrificing an animal while laying a house. A rooster should be enough, but a larger animal could work even better. Bull skulls were often laid under the hut's foundations. Burying ashes of family members under a high doorstep, so their spirits could guard the house. Greeting over a doorstep could make those members angry and even bring evil powers from the outside world into the house. That's why even today people avoid greeting over the doorstep, at least in many places in Europe. A horseshoe above the entrance is a symbol of happiness. Carving 6 petals rosettes on ceiling beams. This protective symbol, oddly enough, survived Christianization and can be found in Slavic highland huts even nowadays. And how more organized settlements looked like. Like strongholds and such, buildings were obviously entirely made of wood and houses looked very similar to village huts. Sometimes logs weren't even debarked. The main difference was high density of buildings. Houses were often built in rows and connected with walls perpendicular to streets. An excellent example of an ancient gated estate is Biskupin settlement in Poland. A fortified settlement built over 2,500 years ago. As most Slavic fortified settlements, it was built in wetlands, in this case on an island in a lake. So water was the first obstacle. The island in Biskupin's lake was surrounded with a wooden palisade set at an angle of 45 degrees and width from 2 to even 9 meters. It was both a defensive wall and breakwater. The main part of fortification was, however, a rampart built of wooden logs forming chests and filled with earth and stones 3 meters wide and probably 6 meters high. However, there were also much larger fortifications over 10 meters wide and high. On the top of it, there were wooden battlements. Probably over the gate there was a defensive tower. Dwellings were built in post and plank structure, briefly mentioned before. Poles were connected with specifically cut logs set horizontally. Additionally, poles were reinforced with pegs. Corner poles were round, while the rest of poles was square. Roofs were probably covered with reed. They were relatively large, 8 meters wide and 9 meters long. All of them were divided into a small vestibule in the southern part and one large room about 60 square meters. To the right there was a fireplace and to the left there was place for beddings. Inside vestibules animals were kept, especially under colder seasons. Entrances placed on southern walls were closed with braids on wooden frames. At the same time, rows of buildings protected from cold northwest winds. Streets were paved with wooden logs. Life flourished on streets and markets. In ancient settlements, inns were especially significant as they were, as you probably figured out, located at market squares. Peculiar forms of settlements were settlements built on water. They weren't floating though, but constructed on platforms based on poles stuck into lakes' bottoms. The most well-known village of this kind consisted of 60 houses based on 1,800 poles. Usually, when history of architecture is discussed, religious buildings are a huge part of the subject. In the case of ancient Slavs, the discussion has rather theoretical dimension, as it's unclear whether ancient Slavic temples were totally destroyed during Christianization, or if they just weren't built. It was probably first in 10th or 11th century that Slavic temples appeared, as a reaction to pressing Christianization and the last stands of old beliefs. This sketch presents a reconstruction of a temple in Grossraden. This one is quite humble, but there are descriptions of very impressive temples as well. An example is Arkona Temple, which allegedly was guarded by 300 warriors. Unfortunately, those descriptions are rather poetic than specific, so it's hard to say much about appearance of those buildings. A huge part of the knowledge about ancient Slavic beliefs is probably irretrievably gone, and attempts of systematization of Slavic pantheon are either guessings or based on stories written hundreds of years after Christianization, so not really reliable. Luckily, there are remainings of really unique statues of deities, which were created for sure by ancient Slavs. And what's so special with them? Strange heads, I would say. Well, maybe heads like heads, it's rather their number that is a little bizarre. Świętowit, a four-head god looking in four worlds' directions. In Arkona, he was depicted with a drinking horn, which was used for fortune-telling. Porevit, 5 heads, Porenot, 4 heads on the neck and 5th face carved in his chest. Triglav, 3 heads, Rogievit, 7 faces and 1 common head stop. Oh, someone may wonder what I'm drawing here. It's one of the very few remainings of Slavic ancient beliefs, though there were some twists regarding its authenticity. There are many theories trying to explain the meaning of all these elements, but there are no proofs confirming any of them. Anyway, this hut is nice. What else can I say? I hope there was something new and interesting for you. Thanks for watching.